Okay, so this morning we're going to start with rectangles. Now, before we get to talking about our properties of our three shapes today that we're going to talk about, we're going to go back and just do a quick review of our parallelogram properties, because all three of these shapes we're going to talk about today are considered to be parallelograms. So let's just list these real briefly. I know these should be kind of fresh in your mind from last week, I hope. Can somebody give me one of our 5 properties of a parallelogram? Okay, so this is just a quick review from what we learned last week. Opposite sides parallel, opposite angles congruent, consecutive angles supplementary, diagonals bisect each other, and then the opposite sides are congruent. Again, the reason that we listed those 5 properties, again, is because these 3 shapes we're going to talk about today, the rectangle, the rhombus, and the square, all 3 of them have these same 5 properties. In other words, they're considered to be parallelograms. Okay, so along with these special properties that we list of the 3 shapes, they also have these 5 properties. Okay, so let's list the special properties. We'll start with the rectangle. First special property of a rectangle, let's just kind of look at the poster up on the front wall. The guy diving says dare to try on it. The guy's diving to catch the ball. That rectangle there, any special property stand out to you that's different than the 5 we just listed? What makes that shape special compared to maybe another parallelogram? Let's focus on the 4 angles in that shape. What's true about the 4 angles? May? Okay, so a rectangle has 4 right angles. Now, the rectangle also has one other special property. Probably hard to tell from looking at the picture, but if I were to draw in the diagonals in a rectangle, anybody want to take a guess what would be true about the diagonals? Well, the diagonals are congruent. Quick story. First house that my wife and I lived in, we built a deck on the back of the house. Okay, I built it myself. It was in the shape of a rectangle. So I had to dig, I think it was 17 holes with the post hole digger. It was in the middle of the summer and the ground was super hard. So I had a lot of blisters on my hands. I can remember that summer from doing that. But I got all my posts in the ground. But before I started actually putting the wood across the top for the flooring of it, guess what I checked on my corner posts? Well, I took a tape measure and I measured from one corner to the other, and then I measured from the other corner to the diagonal from that corner. Anybody want to guess what I was making sure about my deck? Well, I was making sure that it was square, that way when I started putting those boards across the top, if it was not square, it wasn't gonna look very good. So, and also it probably wasn't gonna be very strong to hold, the weight that it should hold. So those diagonals were off by a couple inches, so I had to move one of my posts to make sure that it was in the shape of a rectangle. Okay, let's move on to the square. So the square, if we look at the one of the ceiling tiles up above us, any special properties you notice about a square? Yeah. All the sides are congruent, so it has 4 congruent sides. How about the angles? Isaac? Yeah, we have 4 right angles. I'll mark these as I look at my picture here. So we've got 4 sides that are the same, 4 right angles. If I draw in my diagonals, we know that the diagonals are congruent. We also know that the diagonals bisect the angles. So if I were marking that in my square, these 2 angles, now because they're bisecting right angles, all 8 of those angles are going to be the same. What would the measure of each of those be if we're bisecting a right angle? What's half of 90? 45. So we know that all these angles in a square would be 45 all the way around the picture. Which leads us to our 5th and final property, and that is, if we know that these are 45 each, what's true about these middle angles? They're going to be 90. So the diagonals form right angles, or another way to say that is they are perpendicular. So these angles in the middle here are going to be right angles. So the square has the most properties. Something else I want to point out to you is a square. Notice it, because it has 4 right angles and because the diagonals are congruent, a square is also considered to be a rectangle. So if you're thinking about that, a square could be a rectangle, but a rectangle will not always be a square. Example would be the poster at the front. Poster, it's a rectangle, but it's not the shape of a square. The ceiling tile, it's a square up above. It's also a rectangle. Okay, last one is a rhombus that we're going to talk about today. So a rhombus, main characteristic of a rhombus is that it has 4 congruent sides. just like a square. So in this case, a square is a type of rhombus. Another important feature of the rhombus is the diagonals will always make right angles. Or in other words, they are perpendicular. And then lastly, for the rhombus, the diagonals bisect the angles. So what that means the opposite angles that are being bisected will form four angles that are the same. And then the other pair of opposite will form four other congruent angles. So like I said from the start, these special properties that we're listing for each of these shapes are going to be true along with the 5 properties of a parallelogram, because all 3 of these shapes are considered to be parallelograms. So you could think of, for the square, it actually has 10 properties. The rhombus has 8. The rectangle has 7.